"That's settled then," said I to him. A quarter of an hour later we embarked on the tender, and at 3 o'clock were comfortably lodged in 2 rooms of Fifth Avenue Hotel. Chapter 35. A week to spend in America. The Great Eastern was to set sail on the 16th of April, and it was now the 9th and 3 o'clock in the afternoon when I set foot on the land of the Union. A week, there are furious tourists and express travelers who would probably find this time enough to visit the whole of North America. But I had no such pretension, not even to visit New York thoroughly, and to write, after this extra rapid inspection, a book on the manners and customs of the Americans. But the constitution and physical aspect of New York is soon seen. It is hardly more varied than a chessboard. The streets, cut at right angles, are called avenues when they are straight, and streets when irregular. The numbers on the principal thoroughfares are a very practical but monotonous arrangement. American cars run through all the avenues. Anyone who has seen 1/4 of New York knows the whole of the great city, except, perhaps, that intricacy 169 of streets and confused alleys appropriated by the commercial population. New York is built on a tongue of land, and all its activity is centered on the end of that tongue. On either side extend the Hudson and East River, arms of the sea, in fact, on which ships are seen and ferry boats ply, connecting the town on the right hand with Brooklyn and on the left with the shores of New Jersey. A single artery intersects the symmetrical quarters of New York, and that is Old Broadway, the Strand of London, and the Boulevard Montmartre of Paris, hardly passable at its lower end where it is crowded with people, and almost deserted higher up, a street where sheds and marble palaces are huddled together, a stream of carriages, omnibuses, cabs, drays, and wagons, with the pavement for its banks, across which a bridge has been thrown for the traffic of foot passengers. Broadway is New York, and it was there that the doctor and I walked until evening. After having dined at Fifth Avenue Hotel, I ended my day's work by going to the Barnum Theatre, where they were acting a play called New York Streets, which attracted a large audience. In the 4th act there was a fire and real fire engines worked by real firemen, hence the great attraction. The next morning I left the doctor to his own affairs, and agreed to meet him at the hotel at 2 o'clock. My 171st proceeding was to go to the post office, 51 Liberty Street, to get any letters awaiting me there. Then I went to No. 2 Bowling Green at the bottom of Broadway, the residence of the French consul, M. Le Baron Gaudry Boileau, who received me very kindly. From here I made my way to cash a draft at Hoffman's. Lastly, I went to number 25 36th Street, where resided Mrs. R., Fabian's sister. I was impatient to get news of Ellen and my 2 friends, and here I learnt that, following the doctor's advice, Mrs. R., Fabian, and Corsican had left New York, taking with them the young lady, thinking that the air and quiet of the country might have a beneficial effect on her. A line from Captain Corsican informed me of this sudden departure. The kind fellow had been to Fifth Avenue Hotel without meeting me, but he promised to keep me acquainted with their whereabouts. They thought of stopping at the first place that attracted Ellen's attention, and staying there as long as the charm lasted. He hoped that I should not leave without bidding them a last farewell. Yes, were it but for a few hours, I should be happy to see Ellen, Fabian, and Corsican once again. But such are the drawbacks of travelling. Hurried as I was, they gone and I going, each our separate ways, it seemed hardly likely I should see them again. At 2 o'clock I returned to the hotel, and found the 171 doctor in the bar-room, which was full of people. It is a public hall, where travellers and passers-by mingled together, finding gratis iced water, biscuits, and cheese. "Well, doctor," said I, "when shall we start?" "At 6 o'clock this evening." "Shall we take the Hudson Railroad?" "No, the St. John, a wonderful steamer, another world, a Great Eastern of the river, one of those admirable locomotive engines which go along with a will. I should have preferred showing you the Hudson by daylight, but the St. John only goes at night. Tomorrow at 5 o'clock in the morning we shall be at Albany. At 6 o'clock we shall take the New York Central Railroad, and in the evening we shall sup at Niagara Falls." I did not discuss the doctor's program, but accepted it willingly. The hotel lift hoisted us to our rooms, and some minutes later we descended with our tourist knapsacks. A fly took us in a quarter of an hour to the pier on the Hudson, before which was the St. John, the chimneys of which were already crowned with wreaths of smoke. Chapter 36. The St. John and its sister ship, the Dean Richmond, are 2 of the finest steamships on the river. They are buildings rather than boats. Terraces rise one above another with galleries and verandas. One would almost have thought it was a gardener's floating plantation. There are 20 flagstaffs, fastened with iron tressings, which consolidate the whole building. The two enormous paddle boxes are painted al fresco, like the tympans in the Church of St. Mark at Venice. Behind each wheel rises the chimney of the two boilers, the latter placed outside instead of in the hull of the steamship, a good precaution in case of explosion. In the center between the paddles is the machinery, which is very simple, consisting only of a single cylinder, a piston worked by a long crossbeam, which rises and falls like the monstrous hammer of a forge, and a single crank communicating the movement to the axles of the massive wheels. 173 passengers were already crowding on to the deck of the St. John. Dean Pitfer and I went to secure a cabin. We got one which opened into an immense saloon, a kind of gallery with a vaulted ceiling, supported by a succession of Corinthian pillars. Comfort and luxury everywhere, carpets, sofas, ottomans, paintings, mirrors, even gas, made in a small gasometer on board. At this moment the gigantic engine trembled and began to work. I went on to the upper terraces. At the stern was a gaily painted house, which was the steersman's room, where 4 strong men stood at the spokes of the double rudder wheel. After walking about for a few minutes, I went down onto the deck, between the already heated boilers, from which light blue flames were issuing. Of the Hudson I could see nothing. Night came, and with it a fog thick enough to be cut. The St. John snorted in the gloom like a true mastodon. We could hardly catch a glimpse of the lights of the towns scattered along the banks of the river, or the lanterns of ships ascending the dark water with shrill whistles. At 8 o'clock I went into the saloon. The doctor took me to have supper at a magnificent restaurant placed between the decks, where we were served by an army of black waiters. Dean Pitfer informed me that the number of passengers on board was more than 4,000, reckoning 1,500 emigrants stowed away in 174, the lower part of the steamship. Supper finished, we retired to our comfortable cabin. At 11 o'clock I was aroused by a slight shock. The St. John had stopped. The captain, finding it impossible to proceed in the darkness, had given orders to heave to, and the enormous boat, moored in the channel, slept tranquilly at anchor. At 4 o'clock in the morning the St. John resumed her course. I got up and went out under one of the verandas. The rain had ceased, the fog cleared off, the water appeared, then the shores. The right bank dotted with green trees and shrubs which gave it the appearance of a long cemetery. In the background rose high hills, closing in the horizon by a graceful line. The left bank, on the contrary, was flat and marshy. The fog cleared off. Dr. Pitfer had just joined me under the veranda. "Good morning, friend," said he, after having drawn a good breath of air. "Do you know we shall not be at Albany in time to catch the train, thanks to that wretched fog? This will modify my program." "So much the worse, doctor, for we must be economical with our time." "Right, we may expect to reach Niagara Falls at night instead of in the evening. That is not my fault, but we must be resigned." The St. John, in fact, did not moor off the Albany 175 quay before 8 o'clock. The train had left, so we were obliged to wait till 1:30. In consequence of this delay we were able to visit the curious old city, which forms the legislative center of the state of New York. The lower town, commercial and thickly populated, on the right bank of the Hudson, and the high town with its brick houses, public buildings, and its very remarkable museum of fossils. One might almost have thought it a large quarter of New York transported to the side of this hill, up which it rises in the shape of an amphitheater. At 1 o'clock, after having breakfasted, we went to the station, which was without any barrier or officials. The train simply stopped in the middle of the street, like an omnibus. One could get up and down at pleasure. The cars communicate with each other by bridges, which allow the traveller to go from one end of the train to the other at the appointed time, without seeing either a guard or a porter, without a bell, without any warning. The brisk locomotive, a real gem of workmanship, started, and we were whirled away at the speed of 50 miles an hour. But instead of being boxed up as one is in European trains, we were at liberty to walk about, buy newspapers and books without waiting for stations. Refreshment buffets, bookstalls, everything was at hand for the traveller. We were now crossing fields without fences, and forests newly cleared at the risk of a collision with the felled trees. 176 through new towns, seamed with rails but still wanting in houses, through cities adorned with the most poetic names of ancient literature, Rome, Syracuse and Palmyra. It was thus the Mohawk Valley, the land of Fenimore, which belongs to the American novelist, as does the land of Rob Roy to Walter Scott, glided before our eyes. For a moment Lake Ontario, which Cooper has made the scene of action of his masterwork, sparkled on the horizon. All this theatre of the grand epopee of leather stocking, formerly a savage country, is now a civilized land. The doctor did not appreciate the change, for he persisted in calling me Hawk's Eye and would only answer to the name of Chingachgook. At 11 o'clock at night we changed trains at Rochester. The spray from the Tennessee Cascades fell over the cars in showers. At 2 o'clock in the morning, after having kept alongside the Niagara for several leagues without seeing it, we arrived at the village of Niagara Falls, and the doctor conducted me to a magnificent hotel, grandly named Cataract House. Chapter 37. The Niagara is not a stream, not even a river. It is simply a weir sluice, a canal 36 miles long, which empties the waters of the Lakes Superior, Michigan, Huron and Erie into the Ontario. The difference in the level of these last two lakes is 340 feet. This difference uniformly proportioned the whole of the width would hardly have created a rapid, but the falls alone absorb half the difference in level, whence their formidable power. This Niagarine Trench separates the United States from Canada. Its right bank is American and its left English, on one side policemen, on the other not the shadow of one. On the morning of the 12th of April, at break of day, the doctor and I walked down the wide street of Niagara Falls, which is the name of the village situated on the banks of the falls. It is a kind of small watering place, 300 miles from Albany, built in a healthy and charming situation, provided with sumptuous hotels and comfortable villas, which the Yankees and Canadians frequent in the season. The weather was magnificent, the sun warmed the cold atmosphere, a dull, distant roar was heard, and I saw vapors on the horizon which could not be clouds. "Is that the fall?" I asked of the doctor. "Patience," replied Pitford. In a few minutes we were on the banks of the Niagara. The river was flowing peacefully along. It was clear and not deep, with numerous projections of grey rock emerging here and there. The roar of the cataract grew louder and louder, but as yet we could not see it. A wooden bridge, supported by iron arches, united the left bank to an island in the midst of the current. Onto this bridge the doctor led me. Above stretched the river as far as the eye could reach. Down the stream, that is to say on our right, the first unevenness of a rapid was noticeable. Then, at half a mile from the bridge, the earth suddenly gave way, and clouds of spray filled the air. This was the American Fall, which we could not see. Beyond, on the Canadian side, lay a peaceful country, with hills, villas, and bare trees. Don't look," cried the doctor to me. "Reserve yourself, shut your eyes, and do not open them until I tell you." I hardly listened to my original but continued to look. The bridge crossed, we set foot on the island known as 179 Goat Island. It is a piece of land of about 70 acres, covered with trees, and intersected with lovely avenues with carriage drives. It is like a bouquet thrown between the American and Canadian falls, separated from the shore by a distance of 300 yards. We ran under the great trees, climbed the slopes and went down the steps. The thundering roar of the falls was redoubled, and the air saturated with spray. "Look," cried the doctor. Coming from behind a mass of rock, the Niagara appeared in all its splendor. At this spot it meets with a sharp angle of land, and falling round it forms the Canadian Cascade, called the Horseshoe Fall, which falls from a height of 158 feet and is 2 miles broad. Nature has combined everything to astonish the eye. In this, one of the most beautiful spots in the world, nature has combined everything to astonish the eye. The fall of the Niagara singularly favors the effects of light and shade. The sunbeams falling on the water capriciously diversify the color, and those who have seen this effect must admit that it is without parallel. In fact, near Goat Island the foam is white. It is then a fall of snow, or a heap of melted silver, pouring into the abyss. In the center of the cataract, the color of the water is a most beautiful sea green, which indicates its depth, so that the Detroit, a ship drawing 20 feet and launched on the 180 current, was able to descend the falls without grazing. Towards the Canadian shore the whirlpool, on the contrary, looks like metal shining beneath the luminous rays, and it is melted gold which is now poured into the gulf. Below, the river is invisible from the vapors which rise over it. I caught glimpses, however, of enormous blocks of ice accumulated by the cold of winter. They take the form of monsters, which, with open jaws, hourly absorb the 100 millions of tons poured into them by the inexhaustible Niagara. Half a mile below the cataract the river again became tranquil, and presented a smooth surface, which the winds of April had not yet been able to ruffle. "And now for the middle of the torrent," said the doctor to me. I could not imagine what the doctor meant by those words, until he pointed to a tower built on the edge of a rock some 100 feet from the shore, almost overhanging the precipice. This monument, raised in 1833 by a certain audacious being, one Judge Porter, is called the Terrapin Tower. We went down the steps of Goat Island, and coming to the height of the upper course of the Niagara, I saw a bridge, or rather some planks, thrown from one rock to the other, which united the tower with the banks of the river. The bridge was but a few feet from the abyss, and below it 181 roared the torrent. We ventured on these planks, and in a few minutes reached the rock which supported Terrapin Tower. This round tower, 45 feet in height, is built of stone, with a circular balcony at its summit, and a roof covered with red stucco. The winding staircase, on which thousands of names are cut, is wooden. Once at the top of the tower, there is nothing to do but cling to the balcony and look. The tower is in the midst of the cataract. From its summit the eye plunges into the depths of the abyss and peers into the very jaws of the ice monsters as they swallow the torrent. One feels the rock tremble which supports it. It is impossible to hear anything but the roaring of the surging water. The spray rises to the top of the monument, and splendid rainbows are formed by the sun shining on the vaporized water. By a simple optical illusion, the tower seems to move with a frightful rapidity, but happily in the opposite direction to the fall, for with the contrary illusion it would be impossible to look at the gulf from giddiness. Breathless and shivering, we went for a moment inside the top landing of the tower, and it was then that the doctor took the opportunity of saying to me, "This Terrapin Tower, my dear sir, will some day fall into the abyss, and perhaps sooner than is expected." "Ah, indeed." 182, there is no doubt about it. The Great Canadian Fall recedes insensibly, but still it recedes. The tower, when it was first built in 1833, was much farther from the cataract. Geologists say that the fall in the space of 35,000 years will be found at Queenstown, 7 miles up the stream. According to Mr. Bakewell, it recedes a yard in a year, but according to Sir Charles Lyell, 1 foot only. The time will come when the rock which supports the tower, worn away by the water, will glide down the falls of the cataract. Well, my dear sir, remember this: the day when the Terrapin Tower falls, there will be some eccentrics who will descend the Niagara with it. I looked at the doctor, as if to ask him if he would be of that number, but he signed for me to follow him, and we went out again to look at the Horseshoe Fall and the surrounding country. We could now distinguish the American Fall, slightly curtailed and separated by a projection of the island, where there is another small central cataract 100 feet wide. The American Cascade, equally fine, falls perpendicularly. Its height is 164 feet, but in order to have a good view of it, it is necessary to stand facing it, on the Canadian side. All day we wandered on the banks of the Niagara, irresistibly drawn back to the tower, where the roar of the water, the spray, the sunlight playing on the vapors, the excitement and the briny odor of the cataract, holds you 183 in a perpetual ecstasy. Then we went back to Goat Island to get the fall from every point of view, without ever being wearied of looking at it. The doctor would have taken me to see the Grotto of Winds, hollowed out underneath the central fall, but access to it was not allowed, on account of the frequent falling away of the rocks. At 5 o'clock we went back to the hotel, and after a hasty dinner served in the American fashion, we returned to Goat Island. The doctor wished to go and see the Three Sisters, charming little islets scattered at the head of the island. Then, with the return of evening, he led me back to the tottering rock of Terrapin Tower. The last rays of the setting sun had disappeared behind the grey hills, and the moon shed her soft, clear light over the landscape. The shadow of the tower stretched across the abyss. Farther down the stream the water glided silently along, crowned with a light mist. The Canadian shore, already plunged in darkness, contrasted vividly with the moonlit banks of Goat Island and the village of Niagara Falls. Below us the gulf, magnified by the uncertain light, looked like a bottomless abyss in which roared the formidable torrent. What effect, what artist could ever depict such a scene, either with the pen or paintbrush? For some minutes a moving light appeared on the horizon. It was the signal light of a train crossing the Niagara Bridge at a distance of 2 miles from us. Here we remained silent 184 and motionless on the top of the tower until midnight, leaning over the waters which possessed such a fascination. Once, when the moonbeams caught the liquid dust at a certain angle, I had a glimpse of a milky band of transparent ribbon trembling in the shadows. It was a lunar rainbow, a pale irradiation of the Queen of the Night, whose soft light was refracted through the mist of the cataract. Chapter 38. The next day, the 13th of April, the doctor's program announced a visit to the Canadian shore. We had only to follow the heights of the bank of the Niagara for 2 miles to reach the suspension bridge. We started at 7 o'clock in the morning. From the winding path on the right bank, we could see the tranquil waters of the river, which no longer felt the perturbation of its fall. At 7:30 we reached the suspension bridge. It is the bridge on which the Great Western and New York Central Railroads meet, and the only one which gives access to Canada on the confines of the state of New York. This suspension bridge is formed of 2 platforms, the upper one for trains, and the lower for carriages and pedestrians. Imagination seems to lose itself in contemplating this stupendous work. This viaduct over which trains can pass, suspended at a height of 250 feet 186 above the Niagara, again transformed into a rapid at this spot. This suspension bridge, built by John A. Roebling of Trenton, New Jersey, is 800 feet long and 24 wide. The iron props fastened to the shore prevent it from swinging. The chains which support it, formed of 4,000 wires, are 10 inches in diameter and can bear a weight of 12,400 tons. The bridge itself weighs but 800 tons and cost $500,000. Just as we reached the center, a train passed over our heads, and we felt the platform bend under its weight. It is a little below this bridge that Blondin crossed the Niagara, on a rope stretched from one shore to the other, and not, as is generally supposed, across the falls. However, the undertaking was none the less perilous. But if Blondin astonished us by his daring, what must we think of his friend who accompanied him, riding on his back during this aerial promenade? Perhaps he was a glutton, said the doctor, and Blondin made wonderful omelets on his tight rope. We were now on Canadian ground, and we walked up the left bank of the Niagara, in order to see the falls under a new aspect. Half an hour later we reached the English hotel, where the doctor ordered our breakfast, whilst I glanced through the traveller's book, where figured several thousand names. Among the most celebrated noticed the following: Robert Peel, Lady Franklin, Comte de Paris, Duc de Chartres, Prince de Joinville, Louis Napoleon, 1846, Prince and Princess Napoleon Barnum with his address, Maurice Sand, 1865, Agassiz, 1854, Ormont, Prince Hohenlohe, Rothschild, Burton, Paris, Lady Elgin, Burckhardt, 1832, and c. And now let us go under the falls, said the doctor to me, when we had finished breakfast. I followed Dean Pitford. A Negro conducted us to the dressing room, where we were provided with waterproof trousers, mackintoshes, and glazed hats. Thus equipped, our guide led us down a slippery path, obstructed by sharp-edged stones, to the lower level of the Niagara. Then we passed behind the great fall through clouds of spray, the cataract falling before us like the curtain of a theatre before the actors. But what a theatre! Soaked, blinded, deafened, we could neither see nor hear in this cavern, as hermetically closed by the liquid sheets of the cataract, as though nature had sealed it in by a wall of granite. The cataract falling before us. At 9 o'clock we returned to the hotel, where they relieved us of our streaming clothes. Going back again to the bank, I uttered a cry of surprise and joy. "Captain Corsican!" The captain heard and came towards me. "You here?" he cried. "What a pleasure to see you again." 188 and Fabian and Ellen, I asked, shaking both his hands. "They are here and going on as well as possible, Fabian full of hope, almost merry, and our poor Ellen little by little regaining reason." "But how is it that I meet you at the Niagara?" "The Niagara," repeated Corsican. "Well, it is the principal resort of English and Americans in the warm months. They come here to breathe, to be cured by the sublime spectacle of the falls. Our Ellen seemed to be struck at first sight by this glorious scenery, and we have come to stay on the banks of the Niagara. You see that villa, Clifton House, in the midst of those trees, halfway up the hill? That is where we all live with Mrs. R., Fabian's sister, who is devoted to our poor friend." "Has Ellen recognized Fabian?" I asked. "No, not yet," replied the captain. "You are aware, however, that at the moment when Drake was struck dead, Ellen had a brief interval of consciousness. Her reason became clear in the gloom which surrounded her, but this did not last long. At the same time, since we brought her to breathe this fresh air in this quiet place, the doctor has discovered a sensible improvement in her condition. She is calm, her sleep is tranquil, but there is a look in her eyes as though she were trying to think of something past or present." 189 "Ah, my dear friend," cried I, "you will cure her, but where are Fabian and his betrothed?" "Look," said Corsican, and he pointed towards the shore of the Niagara. In the direction indicated by the captain I saw Fabian, who had not yet noticed us. He was standing on a rock, and a few feet in front of him sat Ellen perfectly motionless, Fabian watching her all the time. This spot on the left bank is known by the name of Table Rock. It is a kind of rocky promontory jutting out into the river, which roars at a distance of 400 feet below. Formerly it was more extensive, but the crumbling away of large pieces of rock has now reduced it to a surface a few yards square. Ellen seemed absorbed in speechless ecstasy. From this place the aspect of the falls is most sublime, as say the guides, and they are right. It gives a view of two cataracts. On the right the Canadian Fall, the crest of which, crowned with vapours, shuts in the horizon on one side, like the horizon of the sea. In front is the American Fall, and above the elegant village of Niagara Falls, half hidden in the trees, on the left the whole perspective of the river flowing rapidly between its high banks, and below the torrent struggling against the overthrown icebergs. Corsican, the doctor, and I went towards Table Rock, 190, but I did not want to disturb Fabian. Ellen was as motionless as a statue. What impression was this scene making on her mind? Was reason gradually coming back to her under the influence of the grand spectacle? Suddenly I saw Fabian step towards her. Ellen had risen quickly and was going near to the abyss with her arms extended towards the gulf, but all at once she stopped and passed her hand rapidly across her forehead, as if she would drive away some thought. Fabian, pale as death but self-possessed, with one bound placed himself between Ellen and the chasm. The latter shook back her fair hair and her graceful figure staggered. Did she see Fabian? No. One would have said it was a dead person coming back to being and looking round for life. Captain Corsican and I dared not move, although, being so near the abyss, we dreaded some catastrophe, but the doctor kept us back. "Let Fabian alone," said he. I heard the sobs which escaped from the young woman's heaving breast, the inarticulate words which came from her lips. She seemed as though she were trying to speak but could not. At last she uttered these words. My God, where am I, where am I?" She was conscious that someone was near her, for she half turned round, and her whole face seemed transfigured. There was a new light in her eyes, as she saw Fabian, trembling and speechless, standing before her with outstretched arms. Fabian, cried she at last. Fabian, cried she at last. Fabian caught her in his arms, where she fell in an unconscious state. He uttered a piercing cry, thinking that Ellen was dead, but the doctor interposed. "Don't be alarmed," said he. "This crisis, on the contrary, will be the means of saving her." Ellen was carried to Clifton House and put to bed, where she recovered consciousness and slept peacefully. Fabian, encouraged by the doctor, was full of hope. Ellen had recognized him. Coming back to us, he said to me, "We shall save her, we shall save her. Every day I watch her coming back to life. Today, tomorrow, perhaps she will be restored to me. Ah, the just God be praised. We will stay here as long as it is necessary for her, shall we not, Archibald?" The captain clasped Fabian in his arms. Then the latter turned to the doctor and me. He loaded us with thanks, and inspired us with the hope which filled his breast, and never was there better reason for hope. Ellen's recovery was near at hand. But we must be starting, and there was hardly an hour for us to reach Niagara Falls. Ellen was still sleeping 192 when we left our dear friends. Fabian and Corsican bid us a last farewell, after having promised we should have news of Ellen by telegram, and at noon we left Clifton House. Chapter 39. Some minutes later we were descending a long flight of steps on the Canadian side, which led to the banks of the river, covered with huge sheets of ice. Here a boat was waiting to take us to America. One passenger had already taken his place in it. He was an engineer from Kentucky, and acquainted the doctor with his name and profession. We embarked without loss of time, and by dint of steering, so as to avoid the blocks of ice, reached the middle of the river, where the current offered a clear passage. From here we had a last view of the magnificent Niagara Cataract. Our companion observed it with a thoughtful air. "Is it not grand, sir? Is it not magnificent?" said I to him. "Yes," replied he, "but what a waste of mechanical force, and what a mill might be turned with such a fall as that." 194. Never did I feel more inclined to pitch an engineer into the water. On the other bank a small and almost vertical railroad, worked by a rope on the American side, hoisted us to the top. At 1:30 we took the express, which put us down at Buffalo at 2:15. After visiting this large new town, and tasting the water of Lake Erie, we again took the New York Central Railway at 6 o'clock in the evening. The next day, on leaving the comfortable beds of a sleeping car, We found ourselves at Albany, and the Hudson Railroad, which runs along the left bank of the river, brought us to New York a few hours later. The next day, the 15th of April, in company with the indefatigable doctor, I went over the city, East River and Brooklyn. In the evening I bade farewell to the good Dean Pitferge, and I felt in leaving him that I left a friend. Tuesday, the 16th of April, was the day fixed for the departure of the Great Eastern. At 11 o'clock I went to 37th Pier, where the tender was to await the passengers. It was already filled with people and luggage when I embarked. Just as the tender was leaving the quay, someone caught hold of my arm, and turning round I saw Dr. Pitferge. "Use," I cried, "and are you going back to Europe?" "Yes, my dear sir." 195, by the Great Eastern. "Undoubtedly," replied the amiable original, smiling. "I have considered the matter, and have come to the conclusion that I must go. Only think, this may be the Great Eastern's last voyage, the one which she will never complete." The bell for departure had rung, when one of the waiters from Fifth Avenue Hotel came running up to me and put a telegram into my hands, dated from Niagara Falls. "Ellen has awakened, her reason has entirely returned to her," said Captain Corsican, "and the doctor has every hope of her recovery." I communicated this good news to Dean Pitferge. "Every hope for her indeed, every hope," said my fellow traveller in a sarcastic tone. "I also have every hope for her, but what good does that do? Anyone may have great hopes for you, for me, for all of us, but at the same time he may be just as much wrong as right." 12 days later we reached Brest, and the day following Paris. The return passage was made without any misfortune, to the great displeasure of Dean Pitferge, who always expected to see the great ship wrecked. And now, when I am sitting at my own table, if I had not my daily notes before me, I should think that the Great Eastern, that floating city in which I lived for a month, the meeting of Ellen and Fabian, the peerless Niagara, Athens, were the visions of a dream. Ah, how delightful is travelling, even when one does return, in spite of what the doctor may say to the contrary. For 8 months I heard nothing of my original, but one day the post brought me a letter, covered with many-coloured stamps, which began with these words: "On board the Corinque, Auckland Rocks, at last we have been shipwrecked." And ended thus: "Was never in better health. Very heartily yours, Dean Pitferge." End of A Floating City. The Blockade Runners. Table of Contents. Chapter Title Page. Chapter 1, The Dolphin, 197. Chapter 2, Getting Under Saw. Chapter 3, 215. Chapter 4, Croxton's Trick, 225. Chapter 5, The Shot from the Iroquois and Miss Jenny's Arguments, 235. Chapter 6, Sullivan Island Chan. Chapter 7, A Southern Genera. Chapter 8, The Escape, 260. Chapter 9, Between Two Fires, 273. Chapter 10, St. Mungo, 284. Chapter 1. The Dolphin. The Clyde was the first river whose waters were lashed into foam by a steamboat. It was in 1812, when the steamer called the Comet ran between Glasgow and Greenock at the speed of 6 miles an hour. Since that time, more than 1 million of steamers or packet boats have plied this Scotch river, and the inhabitants of Glasgow must be as familiar as any people with the wonders of steam navigation. However, on the 3rd of December, 1862, an immense crowd composed of shipowners, merchants, manufacturers, workmen, sailors, women and children thronged the muddy streets of Glasgow, all going in the direction of 198 Kelvin Dock, the large shipbuilding premises belonging to Messrs. Todd and MacGregor. This last name especially proves that the descendants of the famous Highlanders have become manufacturers, and that they have made workmen of all the vassals of the old clan chieftains. Kelvin Dock is situated a few minutes' walk from the town, on the right bank of the Clyde. Soon the immense timber yards were thronged with spectators. Not a part of the quay, not a wall of the wharf, not a factory roof, showed an unoccupied place. The river itself was covered with craft of all descriptions, and the heights of Garvan on the left bank swarmed with spectators. There was, however, nothing extraordinary in the event about to take place. It was nothing but the launching of a ship, and this was an everyday affair with the people of Glasgow. Had the Dolphin, Then, for that was the name of the ship built by Messrs. Todd and MacGregor, some special peculiarity, to tell the truth it had none. It was a large ship, about 1,500 tons, in which everything combined to obtain superior speed. Her engines of 500 horsepower were from the workshops of Lancefield Forge. They worked 2 screws, one on either side the stern post, completely independent of each other. As for the depth of water the Dolphin would draw, it must be very inconsiderable. Connoisseurs were not deceived, and they concluded rightly that this ship was destined for 199 shallow straits. But all these particulars could not in any way justify the eagerness of the people. Taken altogether, the Dolphin was nothing more or less than an ordinary ship. Would her launching present some mechanical difficulty to be overcome? Not any more than usual. The Clyde had received many a ship of heavier tonnage, and the launching of the Dolphin would take place in the usual manner. In fact, when the water was calm, the moment the ebb tide set in, the workmen began to operate. Their mallets kept perfect time falling on the wedges meant to raise the ship's keel. Soon a shudder ran through the whole of her massive structure. Although she had only been slightly raised, one could see that she shook, and then gradually began to glide down the well-greased wedges, and in a few moments she plunged into the Clyde. Her stern struck the muddy bed of the river, then she raised herself on the top of a gigantic wave, and, carried forward by her start, would have been dashed against the quay of the Govan timber-yards, if her anchors had not restrained her. She plunged into the Clyde. The launch had been perfectly successful. The Dolphin swayed quietly on the waters of the Clyde. All the spectators clapped their hands when she took possession of her natural element, and loud hurrahs arose from either bank. But wherefore these cries and this applause? 200 undoubtedly, the most eager of the spectators would have been at a loss to explain the reason of his enthusiasm. What was the cause, then, of the lively interest excited by this ship? Simply the mystery which shrouded her destination. It was not known to what kind of commerce she was to be appropriated, and in questioning different groups the diversity of opinion on this important subject was indeed astonishing. However, the best informed, at least those who pretended to be so, agreed in saying that the steamer was going to take part in the terrible war which was then ravaging the United States of America. But more than this they did not know, and whether the Dolphin was a privateer, a transport ship, or an addition to the Federal Marine, was what no one could tell. "Hurrah!" cried one, affirming that the Dolphin had been built for the southern states. "Hip, hip, hip!" cried another, swearing that never had a faster boat crossed to the American coasts. Thus its destination was unknown, and in order to obtain any reliable information one must be an intimate friend, or, at any rate, an acquaintance of Vincent Playfair and Co., of Glasgow. A rich, powerful, intelligent house of business was that of Vincent Playfair and Co. in a social sense, an old and honourable family, descended from those tobacco lords who 201 built the finest quarters of the town. These clever merchants, by an act of the Union, had founded the first Glasgow warehouse for dealing in tobacco from Virginia and Maryland. Immense fortunes were realised, mills and foundries sprang up in all parts, and in a few years the prosperity of the city attained its height. The House of Playfair remained faithful to the enterprising spirit of its ancestors. It entered into the most daring schemes, and maintained the honour of English commerce. The principal, Vincent Playfair, a man of 50, with a temperament essentially practical and decided although somewhat daring, was a genuine shipowner. Nothing affected him beyond commercial questions, not even the political side of the transactions, otherwise he was a perfectly loyal and honest man. However, he could not lay claim to the idea of building and fitting up the Dolphin. She belonged to his nephew, James Playfair, a fine young man of 30, the boldest skipper of the British merchant marine. It was one day at the Tontine coffee room under the arcades of the town hall that James Playfair, after having impatiently scanned the American journal, disclosed to his uncle an adventurous scheme. "Uncle Vincent," said he, coming to the point at once, "there are £2 millions to be gained in less than a month." 202, and what to risk? Asked Uncle Vincent. "A ship and a cargo." "Nothing else?" "Nothing except the crew and the captain, and that does not reckon for much." "Let us see," said Uncle Vincent. "It is all seen," replied James Playfair. "You have read the Tribune, the New York Herald, the Times, the Richmond Inquirer, the American Review." "Scores of times, nephew." "You believe, like me, that the war of the United States will last a long time still?" "A very long time." You know how much this struggle will affect the interests of England, and especially those of Glasgow. And more especially still the House of Playfair and Co., replied Uncle Vincent. There's especially, added the young captain. I worry myself about it every day, James, and I cannot think without terror of the commercial disasters which this war may produce. Not but that the House of Playfair is firmly established, nephew. At the same time it has correspondents which may fail. Ah, those Americans, slaveholders or abolitionists, I have no faith in them. If Vincent Playfair was wrong in thus speaking with 203 respect to the great principles of humanity, always and everywhere superior to personal interests, he was, nevertheless, right in a commercial point of view. The most important material was failing at Glasgow. The cotton famine became every day more threatening. Thousands of workmen were reduced to live upon public charity. Glasgow possessed 0 looms by which 625,000 yards of cotton were spun daily, that is to say, 50 millions of pounds yearly. From these numbers it may be guessed what disturbances were caused in the commercial part of the town when the raw material failed altogether. Failures were hourly taking place, the manufactories were closed, and the workmen were dying of starvation. It was the sight of this great misery which had put the idea of his bold enterprise into James Playfair's head. I will go for cotton and will get it, cost what it may. But as he also was a merchant as well as his Uncle Vincent, he resolved to carry out his plan by way of exchange, and to make his proposition under the guise of a commercial enterprise. Uncle Vincent, said he, this is my idea. Well, James, it is simply this. We will have a ship built of superior sailing qualities and great bulk. That is quite possible. 204. We will load her with ammunition of war, provisions and clothes. Just so. I will take the command of this steamer. I will defy all the ships of the Federal Marine for speed, and I will run the blockade of one of the southern ports. You must make a good bargain for your cargo with the Confederates who will be in need of it, said his uncle. And I shall return laden with cotton, which they will give you for nothing. As you say, uncle, will it answer? It will, but shall you be able to get there? I shall if I have a good ship. One can be made on purpose, but the crew. Oh, I will find them. I do not want many men enough to work with, that is all. It is not a question of fighting with the Federals but distancing them. They shall be distanced, said Uncle Vincent in a peremptory tone. But now tell me, James, to what port of the American coast do you think of going? Up to now, uncle, ships have run the blockade of New Orleans, Wilmington and Savannah, but I think of going straight to Charleston. No English boat has yet been able to penetrate into the harbor, except the Bermuda. I will do like her, and if my ship draws but very 205 little water, I shall be able to go where the Federalists will not be able to follow. The fact is, said Uncle Vincent, Charleston is overwhelmed with cotton. They are even burning it to get rid of it. Yes, replied James. Besides, the town is almost invested, Beauregard is running short of provisions, and he will pay me a golden price for my cargo. Well, nephew, and when will you start? In 6 months. I must have the long winter nights to aid me. It shall be as you wish, nephew. It is settled then, uncle. Settled. Shall it be kept quiet? Yes, better so. And this is how it was that 5 months later the steamer Dolphin was launched from the Kelvin Dock timber yards, and no one knew her real destination. Chapter 2. Getting under sail. The Dolphin was rapidly equipped, her rigging was ready, and there was nothing to do but fit her up. She carried 3 schooner masts, an almost useless luxury. In fact, the Dolphin did not rely on the wind to escape the Federalists, but rather on her powerful engines. Towards the end of December, a trial of the steamer was made in the Gulf of the Clyde. Which was the most satisfied, builder or captain, it is impossible to say. The new steamer shot along wonderfully, and the patent log showed a speed of 17 miles an hour, a speed which as yet no English, French or American boat had ever obtained. The Dolphin would certainly have gained by several lengths in a sailing match with the fastest opponent. The loading was begun on the 25th of December, the steamer having ranged along the steamboat quay, a little 207 below Glasgow Bridge, the last which stretches across the Clyde before its mouth. Here the wharfs were heaped with a heavy cargo of clothes, ammunition and provisions, which were rapidly carried to the hold of the Dolphin. The nature of this cargo betrayed the mysterious destination of the ship, and the House of Playfair could no longer keep its secret. Besides, the Dolphin must not be long before she started. No American cruiser had been signaled in English waters. And then, when the question of getting the crew came, how was it possible to keep silent any longer? They could not embark them even without informing the men whither they were bound, for after all, it was a matter of life and death, and when one risks one's life, at least it is satisfactory to know how and wherefore.